So excited to host our wonderful next 2 hours. My name is Meredith Garofalo, and I have been doing this now for, I think, almost 2 years, especially with this hosting within the last year. If you're not familiar with my background, I have a nickname of Rocket Girl. I've covered space launches for the media. I am a certified broadcast meteorologist, a senior meteorologist at my station, as well as a space and science correspondent, one of the very few scientists that actually do reporting and journalism and get to tell these really exciting stories and get these conversations going. I work right now in the New York City market for News 12. I have a background in meteorology, but clearly I've gotten bitten by the space bug over the years. And so now here I am. Since 2017, I've really gotten into space storytelling, helping these space companies tell their stories, get people excited like we were when the space race began or the shuttle era. This is the new era. This is the Artemis generation, as some people call it. This is our time to take space and space storytelling to the next galaxy. And so by you joining Conversations for the Future this morning, we are doing just that. And we have some really exciting conversations we're going to be taking part in. So I'm going to grab my notes right now to make sure that you know everything about what we will be discussing and who is going to be taking over. So this is our first one for 2023. If you're a newbie, you are in for a great conversation. If you've joined before, you know how fun and exciting this is. But first up, we actually have a new monthly segment. This is called Coffee on the Moon. On the moon, obviously trying with my background, but if I was, who other to run this than the lovely Galaxis gal, Inara Tabir. And in this segment, Inara will be holding interviews to discuss our monthly topic and how through this topic of reference, we're going to work together to be a multi-planetary society. So Inara, without further ado, can you take it away? And let's meet your fantastic guests that we're going to be hearing from.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I'm excited to be back here with Foundation for the Future for Conversations for the Future, seeing some new faces here. And if you don't know my brand, Coffee on the Moon began with the way that I got involved in space. There's not one way to get in, there's many different ways. And my way was that I built a social media following. I didn't have an education, but I had that, and I went to these different space companies and I would say, you know, I can blow up what you're doing, I can make it huge, I can make the public care about it, and I don't want any money. I just want you to give me a chance. So they would, and I would make it happen, and they would ask me, what do you want in return for this? They were always looking for some sort of like price, you know, money, a job or something. And I would say, I want two things. The first one is, if I bring a meeting to you from someone else, you take the meeting. You don't have to give them what they want, but you have to take the meeting. And the other one is, if you get to space before me, you take me with you and we have a coffee on the moon. So 16 years later, this has been very effective, and I've gotten extremely well connected, and I'm part of different communities. One of those is the I-24 community, which I recently joined. Amazing group of people that are dreaming together and working on going to space. And the founder and leader of that organization is Andrew Titan Parris. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to read this bio because you and I have a couple different connections besides space. It says that you have, what is it, three-time Emmy Award winner in broadcast television. I want to hear about that.
Oh, well, my real job that pays the bills. I'm a broadcast television engineer. I've been working in the industry, well, most of my life. I grew up in it. My dad was in it. But my specialty is remote television broadcasting. And so I work for a company called NEP Group that provides all the remote television equipment and personnel for all the networks around the world. And the 3 Emmys came from, or technical Emmys for different projects. I think one of them was the Summer Olympics in Rio, and then 2 from the ESPN 3D shows that we did from 2010 to 2013.
Fantastic. You know, when I talk to the public, oftentimes because of the amazing nature of the Apollo era, where we created these larger than life superheroes out of the astronauts, people think the only way to get involved in space is to be a fighter pilot, or, you know, to have a military background. Did you come from a military background?
No, absolutely not. I was, like I said, my television, the family business. My dad started in television back in the mid 50s. I have 3 other brothers. We're all in television. But we were the Apollo era. We were the kids growing up in the 60s watching the moon landings. In fact, my first real vivid memory of the space program was the Apollo 8 Christmas Eve broadcast from around the moon. And that's the point I realized, hey, this is something to look toward, to aspire to. Being an astronaut, every kid wanted to be an astronaut, but I became very serious and started writing NASA, getting flight plans and orbit maps and autograph pictures and stuff like that. So I got the space bug. I got bit by the space bug at a very early age.
So from that point to broadcast television, and now with I-24, what led you into this more organized path as far as space goes?
Well, I actually was fortunate enough to work for NASA for 13 years, from 1987 to 2000, doing television. First 3 years doing shuttle landings out at Dryden Flight Research Center, which is now, of course, Armstrong. And then from 1990 to 2000, working in Houston for the Johnson Space Center. And as a contractor, I got to do a lot of everything. I got to scuba dive in the NBL and the WETF with the astronauts doing EVA training. I got to fly zero-G for a couple of years. That was one of the best experiences I could ever have. I got to travel for NASA quite a bit, documenting space station construction all over the country. In fact, got to go to Moscow 3 times. Got to go document the launch of the first space station crew from Kazakhstan. So it was a dream come true, being able to tell my job, television, but doing it at NASA and experiencing and meeting people and astronauts and the whole 9 yards. Unfortunately, as a contractor, you have a limited lifetime at NASA, and so I left in 2000. But fortunately, I'd been working with Mark Cuban to start the first all high definition television network called HDNet. So I got to go work for him for 5 years, and then moved over to NAP in 2005. But space was always something I wanted to do, and it was inspiration for that. It got me back into it, as it's done for many people. It got me thinking, yeah, that's something I left behind. I want to go back, and I want to go back big. I want to go to space, and so signing up for the Inspiration 4 contest, the charity seat, was the first start. And then along the way, there was a whole bunch of us who had all entered for one reason or another, and we started communicating on Twitter, and we kind of all connected. And so at the launch for the Inspiration 4 launch in September of 2021, we all met up, and we actually had a dinner the night before the launch. And we're all talking and just enjoying each other's conversation. At one point during the dinner, the music in the restaurant died down, and I said out loud, almost uncontrollably, I said, somebody at this table is going to fly in space. And everybody's like, yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, our group decided to kind of organize. After a few months of staying in communications after the launch, we decided to organize as the Inspired 24. And the reasoning behind that was there were 24 of us at the dinner, excuse me, and we were all very inspired. Inspiration 4 inspired us, so we started Inspired 24. Anyway, we're about 88 folks strong, including Trek. That's Inara's call sign. Mine's Titan. That was given to me. And my prediction actually is almost completely come true. Organization, aerospace company called Uplift Aerospace out of Park City, Utah, started a Web3 organization called Space Plus. And they had, in April of last year, they had essentially a contest where they would pick 5 people from the group, from their Web3 group, and one of them would win a seat on New Shepard. And of the 5 finalists, 4 of them were Inspired 24 members. And the winner was Ruben Salinas, one of our founding members, is going to be flying on New Shepard next year. And we're above and beyond proud that our group has done so well so quickly. And we just draw people from all over the world. We're now in South Asia, Australia, South America, and Europe, and all over the United States. It's just something that came together so organically. It's tough to keep your hands on it, but we don't want to. I'm trying not to control it too much. It's kind of a mutual admiration society at some point. But we're really just about helping each other eventually experience the overview effect.
I love that you're using that word inspiration. It's so important. One of the big parts of inspiration is hope, and knowing that you have something you can do with that. And right now I see it, the Apollo era obviously has galvanized and inspired so many people to go into the sciences, to dream that they can do bigger things. And I was worried for quite a while that we were going to lose any kind of ability to connect with the public. But then we saw the rise of SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, and people started getting excited. And unfortunately, sometimes they like the explosions more than the successes. But, through experiential marketing, I think the public has come back on board. What does it mean to you when you're thinking about going to space? I know you're inspired by the Apollo era and you dream about being an astronaut. You've got that as your basis, but the thought of going to space, walk me through that. If you're up there and you're looking out at the Earth from space, what is that moment for you?
Oh boy. That's a tough one. I've actually had a couple of dreams in my adult life about going into space, and they were very vivid and very specific. They involved spacewalking and essentially looking down on Earth. And there have been some VR movies shot on the ISS that I've experienced, and they're very close to those dreams. But my moment is looking down on the Earth, looking down and taking it all in. I mean, you can see all the pictures, you can do all the VR you want, but being able to actually look out that window and see everybody on the planet who's ever lived, you're looking at your home. It's almost beyond description to me at this point, but it's definitely an inspiration. I started volunteering at Space Center Houston last year, which is another source of my inspiration, being able to talk to the public and being able to engage the average everyday person who just wants to come and learn a little bit about it, especially the kids. The kids are amazing. I can't get enough of them. As a volunteer, I try to engage them as much as I can. I play a little game called Stump the Volunteer, ask them to ask questions. And believe it or not, recently I've gotten stumped a couple times, and I consider myself a bit of a space historian.
So give me a couple of those stumped moments. I'd love to hear those.
There was a young woman who probably 11 or 12, who was obviously well on her way to her doctoral thesis on deep space exploration, had a question about black holes. And I just know a little bit enough about black holes to know I don't know anything about black holes. But she had obviously studied up on them, and she was asking about the event horizon and at what she wanted to know at what point the physics breaks down. I'm like, oh, you mean like how far away? And she's, yeah, about how many kilometers before our physics break down. I'm going, yeah, sorry, you win. Here's a sticker.
I love it. The kids are all right. Definitely. This next generation is becoming very enthusiastic about it. You know, Inspiration 4 did such an amazing job. I was upset, I think maybe worried about the way we were covering space up until that moment, because I felt like we had these great moments happening, these beautiful stories that could have been told. And I wasn't seeing that story development. You and I both come from Hollywood to some degree, and watching Inspiration 4, we got a little bit more of that buildup of the anticipation and understanding who was going and what it meant for them. And so we kind of got to go along with them. I'd love to see more of that, though. From your perspective as a communicator, where are we missing the mark, and how can we improve the way we engage with the public long-term when it comes to space?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's sometimes it's tough to tell those stories in a way that the average person can relate to. It's all about relatability. For example, Inspiration 4, you had 4 people who were, lack of a better word, not randomly, but I mean the Chris Dombrowski's seat was a random selection. But it's tough just to keep people's attention sometimes. I think there's so many other things out there, social media, movies, internet. There's so many other things to keep people's attention. So you've got to find that little hook, and the Inspiration 4 mission was very good at that, in that it was the first of many things, first private commercial flight, first female black pilot, first handicapped person to fly with a disability. And so it's a matter of finding those little hooks to get people's attention. You're not going to get everybody's attention for long term. So you got to be able to find those little things that catch people's attention, but also just keeping the news out there, keep talking about it. And that's really the most important part, is just keep talking about it, especially like the overview effect. That's something we can't talk enough about.
For sure. Well, the relatability, I think, is really critical. The 2 big barriers I experience when I talk to the public about space, one is usually this idea that space is really far away, that any idea of humanity going into space in a big way, besides, a small camping trip, is 1,000 years away. It's funny because somewhere there's some textbook I'm not aware of that uses that terminology or that exact measurement. I keep hearing this. It's 1,000 years away. I'll speak to people and they'll say things like, oh my God, this is so great. It's so inspiring. I really love all of that, but isn't that like 1,000 years away? So I think one of our critical, missions is to help the public understand that we're living in the era of space migration, that we are now living in an era when humanity will go out into space and stay there long term. And so that's, I think, one big piece of it. And the other part of it is that once you help them figure that out, oftentimes it's like, oh my gosh, okay, it's happening right now, but how could I ever be part of that? And I had some guy one day say to me, I would love to be involved in the space industry, but I don't have any skills that they need. And I asked him what he did, what are the skills? And He's like, oh, I'm a computer programmer. And I about fell over, I'm like, listen, we've got room for you. There's a place out there. So I think it's important that, and the other part of it really is that people need to know that they can play part of this, they can be a part of it, but also it impacts them in a way that matters. So a lot of people may see that it's happening now and that they could be part of it, but they are like, this is wasteful. Why aren't we doing this other great thing we should be doing? And it can be anything between, like ending ecological distress or, feeding the homeless. They have their idea of what should be done instead. So I want to help people understand the importance of space. And if that means that they're an environmentalist, and I help them understand that we wouldn't have known how bad the RLC was retreating if we didn't have satellite imagery, or we wouldn't even understand climate change to any great depth without the techniques that we're using from space. Or it's, showing them the instruments that were created that they use in their everyday lives because of the space program. But I want to find some way to help the public feel like this is something that they can be part of, that it is part of their story. I look at Hollywood and, we spend $600 billion a year to entertain people, and they find so many levels of connection and meaning. Is there a way for us to find those layered connection points for people in space, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The Hollywood and the movie industry as a whole is a very big part of that. They have the power, they have the tools. And as far as you were mentioning, people talking about why are we going to space? We have more important things we need to take care of. I'm going to borrow a line from a friend of mine, Mike Mungo. He uses, and it's the most succinct one I've heard for so far, is solve for space, solve for Earth. Absolutely. Everything we live with today, all the modern technology. It's something else I talk about in giving tours, like of the Saturn V rocket at the Rocket Park at Space Center Houston, is we owe our lives, our current technology, everything we have is a result of the Apollo, the race to the moon. The technology we've developed all has come from that. And so it benefits everyone to develop this new technology. We learn how to live in space. We learn more about our planet and how to save it, and about the other planets too. Or all the exploration we're doing on Mars, finding about what happened to the water or so forth, can help us see the problems we have here on Earth.
Absolutely. Well, and I would say we can even go one step further. We can talk about these large scale problems, whether it's ecological distress or racial conflict or world hunger. All of these are really the result of an infinitely expanding species, although we hope infinite, and a planet that's not expanding. We have only so many resources, so much space. And so if we look at solving these big problems, which do deserve to be solved, we want to, alleviate these sort of distresses with humanity. Space is the best solve for that. If you're talking about the resource scarcity, space is abundance. When we're looking at things like gold and diamonds, this is nothing out. There's so much out there. So I think we can make the point that these things they care about, we also care about them. And when I think about Earth, Earth is wonderful and beautiful and majestic, but it's a small town in a very big world. So when I'm thinking about, the planet Earth being our entire world, really it's just a small town, and we can get out there into the bigger world and discover all these other things that we can do and we can reach. So that's the message I want to try to get across to people. With I-24, you start off with this dinner and you want to go to space, and other people do as well. And you find this commonality, you're building a community around it, which I think is really beautiful that we can do this, where it used to be neighbors talking with each other and having barbecues over the Apollo era. Now we can build these interlocked communities globally focused on this topic. Where does it go next? You grow the membership for I-24 and everyone ends up going to space. What's next for the group?
Well, that's a good question. We're always looking to the what's next, and we look for a lot of input from our members. The group is essentially just a loose connection at this point, but because we encourage everyone to do their own thing, and then we help each other and support each other in many things. If in theory everybody gets to space, obviously we want to come back and tell their stories. I know Ruben is very anxious about going to tell his story. In fact, Ruben and I have both signed up to fly on the Worldview, the stratospheric balloon rides to 100,000 feet, which I can't even, I'm so excited about it, and that's still 2 to 3 years away. But he mentioned that his flight is only going to be, a 10-minute suborbital flight, but he wants to have the time to look down on the Earth, to spend time looking down and experiencing the overview effect and coming back and talking about it. And that's the really most important part of this stuff. Going to space it's part of our natural instincts to explore. That's the next place we can go, or explore the next go over the next hill, go over the next continent, whatever. but telling the story, coming back and telling the story helping to inspire other people to see us as a multi-planet society. We obviously, as a species, we like to, we can't sit still. And this is just part of the natural progression of it.
You know, there's this phenomenon that happens when you travel. I'm sure you have the same thing. I've traveled and lived all over the world. And, you know, and when I was in Paris at one point, I heard somebody with a similar accent to mine, and instantly we connected. You know, they were speaking English the way I speak English, and it's like, let's go have a coffee. We're best friends now. And this tends to happen when you're in an area where you are small and everything around you is really massive, and you can connect with one or two people. It doesn't matter who they are. You may have walked past them in your hometown without looking at them, but in this space, suddenly you're allied together. And I think with space, it's the same thing. When we go out into space, it's massive and we're tiny. And I think that kind of circumstance could make a unified humanity a reality in a way that we can't really see on planet Earth. So I'm interested to see if the overview effect can translate into a civilization that can get a couple of things a little bit better than we do here. I want to give the audience a little bit of time to ask questions. Meredith, do we have the ability to get some questions to Andrew?
Yes. So first off, this is great, by the way. I'm excited. Being a journalist here myself and a storyteller, I can relate to both of you. Let me take a look here. I'll ask a question first, and then I'll go through and I'll kind of, I guess, scope the questions out for you. You know, Andrew, there's a lot of people out there in the media that, you know, these stories are not being told properly. You see press releases that are regurgitated and read. What could the media community do better to help with storytelling? And, you know, does it start with, you know, getting people like yourselves to come and talk with us? Or is it just, you know, taking that story and maybe having your scientist or your expert on space at the station, taking that story and taking it to the next level?
Both would be good, would be excellent for that. You obviously, there's a lot of regurgitated stories. There's a lot of clickbait stories too. Unfortunately, people are looking for those kind of quick clicks. But yeah, absolutely both. Bringing people like myself and others to talk and tell their stories, which is, you know, the best way to tell a story is somebody just tell their story. But also, once you get a story, find something that the science reporters, science communicators find interesting and think other people would be interested in too also. But yeah, it's just a matter of communications. We're in the communication business, so we should be communicating.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, it is getting more like yourselves and having coffee with Inara and getting these things out on places like LinkedIn where there is more visibility. Because yes, we're doing a lot of great things in the space community, but it's still, until it's properly communicated to the general public, and let's face it, unfortunately, a lot of people still rely on news. I mean, good for me, you know, for my job, but people turn to the news, people turn to websites and social media. They need people that are going to tell the truth, that are going to have the facts out there. So It's good to hear what you guys are doing. So I'm just looking at a few questions. I think somebody wanted to hear a little bit more about this balloon ride, Andrew, that you were. You're like, wow, this is really
Worldview.
I went to something here in New York. It looks really interesting.
Yeah. Worldview is one of, I believe, 3 companies that's planning stratospheric balloon rides to 100,000 feet. Worldview's actually been in the business longest. They've been around since 2012. They've been putting payloads to 100,000 feet, scientific and commercial payloads to 100,000 feet. Essentially, they've developed the ability to loiter. They have a helium-filled balloon, zero pressure helium balloon, and they can take it up to to whatever altitude the customer wants. And then they figured out how to use the winds, the high altitude winds, to loiter over certain parts of the country. I know they had a payload that they had over the going up and down the Rocky Mountains for like 45 days. But they're going to be doing a passenger, commercial passenger. Is going to be a 10-person capsule, 2 crew, 8 passengers. And I said the flight is about a 10 to 12 hour flight, 1 to 2 hours up to altitude, 6 to 8 hours at altitude. So you'll get to be at 100,000 feet for 6 to 8 hours, get to experience the overview effect. You'll be above 99% of the atmosphere. Not only Ruben, myself, but 19 other friends of mine have all signed up. So this has become a very big deal for us. The seats are $50,000. That is quite a chunk of change with your average person. But if you look at the other options, which are, you know, millions of dollars for suborbital flights, and even some of the other balloon rides are several $100,000. We joke, we like that everybody else's budget is marketing for the champagne and caviar, where we're going to be flying on the Bear and Pretzels flight. And that's, to us, that's a good thing, because we like to go up there, and we're actually considering doing our own science war on board, taking cameras to the high altitude photography, even some astronomical photography. I'm working on a ham radio project to contact with the International Space Station. My great grandfather was a ham radio operator for the Union Pacific Radio Railroad, and so the possibilities are endless for that kind of thing.
And I think something like that also inspires that there's room for everybody in space with every different background, whether you're a radio operator, whether you're the postman. I mean, there's so many ways, different directions we're going. And this could go to either one of you. Somebody was commenting on how most people outside the space community don't see the importance of space migration. How can we get that out versus just having stuff on Netflix or videos for people to watch? How can we talk about this and get the conversation going?
Inara, you can start off.
Sure, absolutely. It's a really good question. We look at the Apollo era, people were extremely excited of the fact that humanity could just get to space. And so, when Kennedy said, we're going to do this by the end of the decade, it was this inspiring, flaming moment. We all caught fire. We're like, what do you mean we're going to go to space? Now, I think space is no longer really the barrier that it was. It's still going to be hard. It's still a lot of work. It still takes so much, but we need to move beyond the point where, it's a barrier. And if we look at the ocean as an example, people in the past, learning to circumnavigate the globe, for instance, it was a huge barrier. And when people did this, it itself was an inspiring act, but then we didn't leave it there. We organized global trade and we created routes. And as a species, we spread out across the entire globe. We didn't allow this barrier that we had crossed to become the monument. We went beyond that. And so with space, we have to migrate. We have to live permanently. We have to spread out and explore beyond what we currently know. And I think, you said it, Titan, it's in us. It's who we are. We're explorers naturally. We're always going to push the next boundary. And I think it's what really differentiates us as a species is that we're not comfortable being comfortable. We're always seeking discomfort and what's beyond the next horizon. So for me, I don't know if it's a matter of convincing the public, but I think it's a natural drive. We're not going to be happy with, this boundary we've crossed. We're always going to want to push a little bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. Plus, one of the best ways that we can communicate space is lead by example. I think that's probably one of the best ways of doing it. But the sheer act of doing, I like to say, is you just go do it and people say, hey, it can be done. I'm not, I wanted to be an astronaut. When I was a kid, I remember the day I found out you couldn't be an astronaut if you wore glasses. I wore glasses as a child. And so that was, a bit of a barrier. But now, there's anybody can go into space. In fact, I had somebody ask me the other day about what are the requirements for flying on Worldview to the 100,000 feet. Basically, they're using, if you can get on an airliner, you can go on the balloon. So that means that opens it up to literally everyone. If you can get on a commercial airliner, you can go. And I started actually working with Astro Access, George Whiteside's group for people with disabilities and inclusion. And we just had a zero-G flight. I actually was volunteering for them earlier in December in Houston. They were about 5 miles from where I live, so I volunteered to help out, just pick up drinks and stuff like that. Well, they had a weather delay, and I ended up getting to fly with them, filling in for one of their safety guys. So I got to fly zero-G twice last year, which was an amazing experience. But getting to work with people and see proof that people with disabilities can, in fact, go into space, can get in and out of their seats, 5-point harnesses. That was part of the experiments, and all kinds of different experiments they do. That right there helps prove that, hey, if people with limb disabilities or sight disabilities or hearing disabilities can go to space, then that means everyone can, and we can all experience that and help share that with everybody.
I like the way that Tim Crispin puts it. He's the founder of Foundation for the Future. He says, we need to make space boring. And I completely agree. When the Wright brothers first achieved flight, that was global news. It was a huge issue. And now we're all just jumping on planes and hopping all over the globe. So we need to get to the point where there's just field trips to the moon and people are bored and they don't want to go. I think that's where we can really start making a huge impact. I'm excited for Mars personally, but there's just so much to see out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've got another question for Titan. Titan, if we're mentioning space colonization anyway, how does one make a living by living in space? And what are the most likely near-term occupations that will be able to generate enough income to justify the costs off of living on Earth? That's a great question.
That is a very good question. In fact, that kind of goes to something that is becoming kind of an issue, is building the building the economy in space. You're not going to be able to, when you go refuel your space vehicle on the moon at the lunar outpost, they're not going to take a credit card and they're not going to take cash. So that's where the Web3 community is coming in. Being able to use cryptocurrency is part of the realities of living in space. You're right about we want to make space boring. We want to make it the kind of thing like, right now I have to get on a plane. I flew here from Houston to Hawaii for work. That's going to become the norm in the future. You get on a space plane or a vehicle and you end up, I got a meeting on the moon, or I got to go to Mars for a long-term project kind of thing. That's the kind of thing we want to do. And so as far as jobs are concerned, every job that you can think of that is required on Earth will be necessary in space. I mean, even the short term in the next, within the next 10 years with all the commercial space stations coming online, they're not going to be hiring astronauts. They're going to be hiring engineers and scientists and technicians who happen to go work in space. And that'll what it'll be. You'll apply for a job and it'll be, maybe a 6-month stint on the moon or a 2-year turn on Mars, or maybe they'll look for people to settle Mars. They want a permanent position there for a plumber, every job you can think of, they need those people in space. And the short term, it's like I said, it's going to be a few people, but eventually as we start to reach out and settle different planets and moons, those economies will grow within on their own needs, I guess is the way to say it. And so there'll be, you'll need people to make that all work. Robots can only do so much. We need people out there too.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I can't wait till we have, job postings for fast food on the moon, and that's when we know we're going to have made it. Well, Andrew,
Taco Bell on the moon. Sorry, I had to put that out there. That would be really out of this world. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, Andrew Titan, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. So Daniel, you posted a question in the chat, but we're actually going to be introducing you in just a moment, so we can actually dive into that.
Well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I put in my 2 cents there. That IP is really easy to transport. Genetic code for plant engineering and any other code-based IP would be maybe a good economic output.
All right, so if you're not familiar with Dr. Daniel Thompkins, he has a lifelong passion in plant science and has contributed to agriculture and the natural environment with a doctorate degree in plant medicine from the University of Florida. With a diverse 20-year career from academic to industry, he founded Grow Mars in 2017, focused on methods to expand agriculture beyond Earth and how this can be done practically and sustainably with Earth-based use as well. So I'm so excited that you're on and following up with us, because we can't go to space if we can't eat. And we were just talking about fast food, but any kind of food in space is going to be vital.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you say, we can't go to space if we don't have anything to eat, food, right? And you always see air revitalization. How are we going to generate air separate from food? And that just shows the disconnect, that if you're growing your own food there, you're doing the air revitalization, as that loop is closed. So it's very interesting working in agriculture where, 99% of the population, particularly in Western areas, are not engaged with agriculture. We have this luxury of going from predominantly an agriculturally based, labor-based society, and same kind of parallel with space. Is I think probably about 1% of the population is really engaged with space, and there's challenges there in communication for sure.
One of the things two of the things really that astronauts are commonly asked, especially from youth, is, what's the toilet like? How do you go to the bathroom in space? And the other one is like, what do you eat? We want to see the packets of goo, and that shouldn't be that exciting to me. Like, food should not be that exciting in space. That's another thing we should really make boring. Closed loop systems. That's really the key here, right? Food is part of this entire complex system that we're going to be involved in. You talk about Earth and space connecting with this. How can we demonstrate the closed loop systems in a way that brings value to people who don't want to leave the planet, but also those who want to go to space?
When looking at the challenges of food production in space, that carbon loop is intensive, right? So how do we do that in an energetically efficient way? Do we use just passive solar radiation? Do we use LEDs to grow high efficiency, but in a high capital way? it's big questions for, how we continue to grow food on Earth. A number I often point to is actually just the nitrogen loop, which is often missed, is that about 4 to 6% of energy used on Earth is just to fix nitrogen from the air into fertilizers, and then to off gas that again in wastewater treatment systems. And no one thinks of that as like part of their budget, or no one thinks about, the nitrogen cycle in space. So I think carbon obviously has had a lot of attention, how permanent, where is carbon used in our everyday lives? And we're figuring out more and more how relevant it is, everything from bioplastics to renewable chemicals. Kind of in a post-oil world, how do you produce all these renewable chemicals that you need for a variety of things that touch our lives? That will have to be solved for in space. And we're also trying to solve that on Earth as well. Working in both small scale and large scale agricultural systems, it's really about dirt and plastics. So one of the innovations that I was doing is having abundance of plastics and therefore kind of an abundance of food production capability in space. And it's kind of centered around the carbon loop as well.
So where do you feel we are as far as prioritizing closed loop systems and nitrogen and these other aspects you're talking about in the space industry? Like, if you had to kind of give us a report card, how are we doing at the moment?
Well, biosphere is often looked at as, a closed loop model, and a success or a failure, depending on who you talk to. We definitely learned a lot along the way. Ultimately, I consider it a failure because no one else built another one. As you see a lot of these geodesic domes, you see a lot of these biosphere inspired concepts, but they are prone to entropy, right? They take a lot of maintenance. There's construction issues, maintenance issues. No one said, "Oh, I want to build another biosphere. That's so cool. I want to do another one." So I think we need examples of how reproducible and how maintainable these systems can be. And that will be a real ticket. You see a lot of these expensive, even the kitchen garden systems are like $600, and like all of them have failed except for Miracle-Gro because they like sell the fertilizers and starter plugs and stuff. So as easy as it can be to stick the seed in the ground and grow a plant, right? It gets really complex. That's kind of my day job as an agricultural scientist, is solving the plant pathology problems, so the plant diseases, the entomology, the soil and water science, all the things that go wrong in these plant-based agricultural systems. But we can get away from some of those challenges as we advance with technology. But the real trick is you got to be able to outgrow. You have to be able to reproduce that system and expand faster than you die, which is really the secret sauce of life, if you will, is if you're not expanding, you're kind of by default dying.
So I give you an unlimited budget and I say, run with this thing, make it happen, secure this future for humanity. Give me maybe the first 3 steps. Like, what are you going to put all this into right away to get us started in that multi-planetary future for humanity?
So I would put it into a seed-based system. So in that regard, right, you can either send the whole plant, or you can kind of send, the baby plant, where you could send the seed. That's really the same challenge that we have when going out into space. Is you can basically bring the food, you can bring the greenhouse, or you can bring a machine that makes greenhouses exponentially with a lot of their waste products. Because when you produce food, especially in a traditional sense, if it's not green goo, you have a lot of other biomass that actually is highly organized. That, again, you can distill down into a lot of different chemicals. Pretty much all the chemicals you can make from petroleum, you can make out of raw biomass as well. So it's this huge gradient of organization and resources that you can tap into. And so the third option, bringing a piece of hardware that's relatively small, that allows you to bootstrap your production capacity of greenhouses for both orbital, lunar, and Mars. We have architectures for all 3 of them. And it looks like a really exciting system. And ultimately, it's very bio-inspired. If you think of how a plant moves around, it's not the biggest seed that wins. If you ever see like a little tiny sequoia seed, it's like the size of a pinhead. It grows into one of the largest things on Earth. Look at like a coconut. It's this giant seed with a lot of energy packed into it, but it doesn't grow as large, right? So it's really not the size of the seed. If we look at biology and how it works, it's not necessarily the size of the seed or how many there are. It's really, does it have the blueprint to succeed and to keep expanding and be persistent? And so I'm trying to make robust systems that kind of are over the horizon, I just got off the call with someone who works within controlled, basically vertical greenhouses internationally. And I said, who's on the forefront of this stuff? And, it's still, agriculture is a slow cycle. It's slower than the university cycle, unfortunately, where you have professors that turn over every 20 or 30 years. Farmers turn over like every 40 or 50 years. So it's a very slow product cycle. Almost everything we do in agriculture, basically someone was doing it 20 years earlier. So,
well, I think it's really dangerous to disrupt too. And I think that's where we find some pushback. I live in an area with lots of farmers, and they won't sell their land to anyone unless they can guarantee that person's going to carry on the crops that their family has been, taking care of for generations. It's terrifying to farmers, the idea of their land going to some use besides feeding people. And I think the general public has a concern about disrupting food supply. So I think that may be part of the reason why we get such pushback when it comes to innovating in, the food cycle. As far as your work goes, what sort of like pushback have you experienced? Where is the messaging not working out? Like, how can we get this message out in a way that it will allow you to make those changes necessary for that multiplanetary future and for, integrated closed loop systems on the planet?
Yeah, I think the message of being able to bootstrap them, very much how biology is very bootstrapped, is showing that from an infrastructural standpoint, is showing examples where you can start with very minimal resources, something as simple as a 3D printer and some basic distillery equipment, and actually produce a highly functional material resource to use that allows you to do things you otherwise wouldn't be able to, just with the natural environment or the economy that you're within. So hopefully we can do some demonstrations on how you can use biology to do a lot of work for you, which ultimately it will do within these systems. It will do the air revitalization, will do the cleaning of the water, the ecological services of providing ultimately clean water out the other ends of these systems. So that's why I kind of talk about agriculture in space, because it's a much bigger umbrella. It's from a material science standpoint, habitats, clothing, food, clean water. It's all of those things. It's really food production and all those ecological services that do a lot of work for us on Earth. How do we do all those in a very structured but expandable environment that really shows people this isn't, you look at a lot of the space art and you see a lot of hardware. You see, oh, that's another $1 billion for Lockheed Martin. Oh, that's another. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to reproducibility and sustainability. And hopefully we can, architect how some of these smart cities, these future cities, if you will, that would be an ideal project, I think. A lot of those have a lot of the same constraints, and you literally just change the background of those, and they almost look identical in aesthetics and in some of the components that they're incorporating into their design elements. So hopefully we can find some good futuristic Earth-based demonstration sites to demonstrate this, as well as use it in space.
Absolutely. I think in some ways, when you're building rockets or you're building satellites, you almost have it easier with the public, even though we've talked earlier about the hardships when it comes to communicating the importance of those things to the public. You almost have it easier because we expect a rocket to be involved in space. We expect satellites to be a space thing. And maybe it's a little bit harder when you're talking about agriculture, because some people will say, oh, well, a whole system of agriculture and chemical processing, and well, that's all kind of too far down the line. Why should we prioritize it now? But I think you've got it easier, maybe in the sense that funding is going to come much easier for your projects, because those are instantly applicable right here on Earth. Am I right?
Yes, I think some of it isn't. It's actually not that shiny of technology. It's not. It's just applied in a new way. For instance, none of this technology didn't exist in 1952. So actually, if we had pursued biological life support and we thought of that carbon loop a little bit differently, before we even went to Apollo, when they were looking at using bioregenerative life support systems, which there's resilience issue. Okay, what if your algae dies? But thinking larger about staying, that's what excites me about the Artemis program, is this whole idea of, if we stay, that's a new technological barrier that we break through. We went to the moon 50 plus years ago, but if we go there to stay, that has a huge a huge technology package that will need to be developed, that will have a lot of relevance. But again, I don't think it can be $1 trillion camping trip. It has to show people on Earth, wow, even in the extremes of the moon with extreme limited water resources, extreme thermal conditions, they can thrive and expand. That I think has big geopolitical take-home messages to Earth, is saying, oh, wow, regardless of where I am in Earth and what resources I have, we can do resource creation on site. And I think that will be a big moment, however it's implemented.
Absolutely. If we look at the context of the Apollo era, DARPA and NASA arose at the same time out of the Sputnik craze and this fear that Russia was going to beat us somehow to space and have a military advantage. And so really, as great as it was, because NASA did an amazing job and the Apollo era was heroic, it really was an extension of a geopolitical will that wanted to make sure Russia didn't beat America to a strategic point. So I don't think they were really thinking about the bigger picture of a human civilization in space. It was more like, two kids fighting over something and one of them licks it first, it's mine. You have to back off. I got there first. Now we're looking at a whole new era of real migration into space. And we're talking about civilizations and we're talking about cities. And Elon Musk is saying things like, we're going to put 1 million people into space. Now that we have this ideal, do you feel like there is a real priority in situ and building a civilization out there that's not so dependent on coming back to Earth for supply?
Yeah, even from a waste stream standpoint, especially on the moon, right? ISS, we down mass and burn up a lot of our waste, and we still can't do, laundry in space, right? Is one example that's often pointed out. So there's a lot of resources that we could have been using, from the waste carbon dioxide to all the other waste materials. How do we upcycle those into more infrastructure? And it's kind of exciting because it levels the playing field. Is it really doesn't matter if you have a reusable rocket or if you're using SLS or whatever. In situ resource utilization really reverses that rocket equation and ultimately accomplishes the goal, agnostic of scale, whether you're starting with a very small, mouse habitat or something like that, and you're showing that it can be renewed and expanded using resources in sight. It's really agnostic of scale, is what I see from the examples of biology all around me and those systems to actually accomplishing this space settlement, which we got a lot of pushback, early on. I remember going to some NASA folks early on, and they said, we're not in the business of space colonization. That's not our gig. And the messaging there was even lost with some folks at NASA around, well, it's untethering from Earth's natural resources. It's not colonizing space. It's not settling space. It's figuring out how to live and expand independent of Earth's natural resources. Whatever name you put on it, it has big mission architecture implications, especially for Mars. I mean, you're stuck there for 2 years. You miss a flight or something like that. How small can that lifeboat be? And if you have this ability to bootstrap your way from a material standpoint out of a lot of sticky situations, I think it both within a mission can have a huge impact around survival, as well as on Earth, where people are feeling rather resource limited, I think.
Absolutely. Only 10 years ago, if you were to talk about human exploration of space, you could be barred from certain conferences. You could be kind of blacklisted and seen as, out there, outlandish. It's kind of like the alien topic. If I said I was channeling aliens 10 years ago, I might as well have said that if I was talking about human exploration of space in a big way and some of these science circles. Now we're really getting very comfortable with this idea and it's everywhere. You're going to have to show the systems you're trying to build. And you've talked a little bit before about the hidden space program. Can you touch briefly on that before we go to questions and kind of how you would use that to demonstrate what you can do in space?
Yeah. I think the industry and the funding mechanisms, I mean, I'm here in Washington, D.C., they're very centered around the engineering and manufacturing for these systems ultimately. This whole messy biology, a lot of the engineers just don't like messy biology, period. Too unpredictable. But it does so much work for us, right? I mean, name what food you ate that wasn't biologically derived, or waste, that wasn't biologically processed. Biology just does a lot of work with it for us very efficiently. That's why we use it. So I think going back to your question on the hidden space community, is there are all of these parallels. Maybe it's not coalesced into, oh, these people are working on space settlement technology relevant things, like in wastewater treatment. They're trying to, how do you have a carbon negative wastewater treatment system? Those people are never engaged like with this from the space industry side, trying to solve those challenges. So there's all the genetic engineering of plants, or improvement of plants just generally. There's all these hidden kind of frontier sciences that just aren't coalesced around the challenges of space settlement, but they're very relevant to it. That I think if we brought all this together, there's be thousands of individuals and very exciting, relevant projects that some of those folks probably never think of how they're applicable to space settlement. And that story, that message there, I think is a little bit lost, but maybe we could get enough funding to do it. And I think it's a really low budget number. Again, this work is already being done. It's just not being probably coordinated in any relevance to space settlement. And it is an exciting, important work just for civilization here on Earth. And it's just, oh, okay, here's actually a market. Instead of it being this deep tech, instead of it being the scientist working on a project that's 30 years over the horizon, for some industry or some corporation, oh, here it is. Like, we could send this up to space in a couple of years because it's really relevant for that environment and economy. I think that is a relatively low budget item. I think that's somewhere between like $1 and $3 billion. And you could get a lot of this hardware truly to, regardless of what scale. Now we can manufacture things at incredibly small scale. So, to make a plastic distillation system, that's the size of a desktop printer, you can now do. Whereas 50 years ago, it would have been really hard to do something like that. So the scale of manufacturing, the technology is being developed to address these over the horizon challenges. We just have to kind of figure out what needs to go in the box. What do we bring with us?
That brings up one of the things I really want to focus on for this entire year. What is it going to take to make humanity multiplanetary? I don't think anyone has really asked that question in a way that's structured and targeted enough. We need to be looking at the entire scale of all of our companies that are building hardware, the organizations that are dealing with the public, and as a collective, because really there's no space industry. We have a terrestrial industry with some kind of space flair, but really we don't have an industry in space until we have major infrastructure. And that means we're all going to have our usual market competition mindset that any company has to have, but also kind of an extra layer where we create cooperative models together so that we're building an entire industry, an entire civilization in space. What is it going to take to make us multiplanetary? If we're not asking that question, I don't think we're quite going to get there. So food is going to be a big part of that. I would love to see Congress perhaps incentivize some of these terrestrial companies, like food production, for instance, or plastics, or even clothing, to perhaps create some piece of what we need in space, and they'll get funding for this. That way, we're not having to spin up an entirely new industry or an entirely new company. You could just kind of take a piece of these different companies and dedicate that to what space needs, and they would still be able to derive, value in the terrestrial market. I think I would love to see that kind of strategy going forward. We're almost out of time, but I want to give the audience a little bit of time to ask questions. Do we have some ready?
Yes, we do. Daniel, this question goes out for Daniel. What plants are most important for life support, such as in an orbital habitat? So there are a couple of things that are like the musts, air and water, recycling, food protection, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm sorry, the first part of that question?
If you had to pick like the plants that are most important for life support on another planet, what are those orbital ones?
Interesting. What plants?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, I got an interesting answer for that. So the pioneer plants, I work in big agricultural systems, and we try like everything to disrupt, weedy plants from growing in these really extreme, harsh environments. They are by composition the same as every other plant. So they're nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, their elemental analysis are the same as a tomato plant. They're just a really efficient, resilient, weedy pioneer species. So for regolith extraction, I think we should send them out there. Or for some step of the bioprocessing, we should have really resilient plants that we then harvest that biomass and kind of upcycle that through. Let them do the work for us in extracting those elements and stuff for us.
Awesome. Great. And I think I can get one more in. This one's actually really interesting about, could a set of 3D printers to make greenhouses and other printers, plants to turn lunar dirt into soil, mining, refining equipment? It sounds like, can 3D printers help us out there in space?
I think I saw collectively be considered a von Neumann probe, if I'm looking at the same question there. Yes, I didn't know anything about von Neumann probes, but that's essentially biology. Biology is the only example of a true von Neumann probe where it's starting, well, with one machine essentially and reproducing itself. And I think bioplastic is very energetically cheap to make here on Earth. That's why it's rather cheap. And same thing on space. It's energetically pretty cheap to make, and biology as well. So I think if you were to send a von Neumann probe, I talked about the size of this, being scale agnostic. I think that would be a really interesting way of, you could send a really small system, and then if it's got carbon on site, you could really bootstrap this to a larger system, and actually make the hardware components. There's a researcher in Canada that's very interested in this that I'm working with, to actually try to solve in the 3D printing world, it's called the RipRap project. And it's how do you have a 3D printer make another 3D printer? There's a couple more steps in there that you need that we're figuring out. But yeah, it seems very possible. Obviously, it is possible because biology does it. We just have to figure out how to do it at a larger scale.
I love it. That's the thing about space is now it's just getting us to start thinking anything is possible, whether it's going to take a week, a year, a couple years, all that good stuff. So, well, thank you so much. Inara, did you want to add any closing remarks? We have another couple great guests that we have coming up this hour, but obviously what you guys just had with the coffee was great. And I think another thing we like to do is if you want to put in the comments your contact information, so if someone wants to continue the conversation, they can reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to be back here with Foundation for the Future, one of the organizations I think that's truly looking at a systems approach to how do we build the major infrastructure in space? How do we really create a civilization that's viable? So I'm excited to be here. You can find me on all the socials as Galaxis Gal, and I'm on LinkedIn as Inara Tabir. I'll put the link here in a moment. I want everybody in this community, whether you're in the industry or you're a fan, to start thinking about what it's going to take to make us multiplanetary. That's the question I think that's going to be huge this year. We need a wide focus of all the different pieces that we're missing, because we can't just build a rocket, go to space and hope for the best. We need to know what we don't know. And so that's what's going to come out of that question. So yeah, keep asking that question. What will it take to make us multiplanetary? And let's make it happen.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, Daniel, and of course, Inara. We really appreciate having you guys today to kick off our conversations for the future for this month. And I'm seeing everything in the LinkedIn profiles and the chat. So yes, everybody go in there. Let's make some new friends. Let's keep the conversations going. And speaking of, we have a great guest that's up for the next half hour. I'm excited to introduce Alex Rosalex. So Alex is a technology executive with more than 25 years of experience, 22 which were honed at Amazon. He has 17 years of experience building and leading teams of engineers, project managers, product managers, and data scientists to deliver results for customers. Alex is currently the director of product inclusion at Snap. I just had to. And was an engineer and product leader at Amazon for 22 years. So without further ado, Alex, welcome to Conversations for the Future. We are really excited to have your presentation right now. And of course, everyone listening, don't forget to go in the chat. We'll leave some time for questions toward the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Meredith. I just want to make sure people can hear me. I'm assuming you can.
Good. And I love the Dr. Spock off in the corner.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he keeps me honest. That's what I've got him there for. Yeah, thank you for the great introduction. You saved me from having to do that myself. So yeah, I actually, one thing that is interesting though, is that I recently sort of pivoted my career, having spent 22 years at Amazon, focused on, various aspects of Amazon, e-commerce, search, Alexa, AI, that sort of thing. I recently pivoted to focus on social media at Snap, as well as this concept of product inclusion, which I'll just expand on briefly before I move into the presentation. The concept of product inclusion is relatively new in the tech industry. And the idea is, how do we build for everyone, with everyone? In the tech world, we tend to build for averages, or for sort of a bell curve, the average user customer experience, because we're building at large scale. It's impossible to build, one-offs for everyone. So we tend to build something that is a one size fits all. is it's only gotten us so far. And what we're learning is that there's a big opportunity to serve the outsides of that bell curve, or the edges. And so what that means is that we need to start thinking about who are the people that are using our product, but we may not be listening to, we may not be hearing what their challenges are, and how do we build to serve those populations. And so I'm super excited to be working in this space because it presents so many unique challenges. And also working in social media as well, I think is just the kind of future of how we communicate is through these sorts of networks. So yeah, so today I want to talk about what we can learn from social media, social messaging to enable communication in space. And so before I go into that, I just want to talk about some of the key challenges that will come from space communication that might benefit from innovations in the social media space. So when it comes to communication, bandwidth and data rate is one of the biggest factors. It can mean the difference between grainy black and white video or a high definition 4K color video. The good news is that bandwidth in space is getting better every day. NASA is developing ways to communicate with infrared lasers, which is also known as optical communications, which will result in higher data rates. So as an example, Artemis 2 will have an optical terminal that's capable of sending 4K ultra video from lunar orbit. And for reference, 4K is about 4 times the resolution of the average social media video. So that's quite a bit. We get by quite well with that. Another concern is latency. So communication is bound by the universal speed limit, the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. When spacecraft are close to Earth, that delay is pretty negligible. But when we get further out, it could take anywhere from 4 to 24 minutes to reach its destination, and then another 4 to 24 minutes to receive a response. That's because at its closest, Mars is 35 million miles away, and the furthest distance planets are 250 million miles away. So that's definitely going to be a factor, latency. Interference is another factor. The further communications have to travel, the more interference they have to deal with. That's interference such as the atmosphere, the sun, other missions that are transmitting data, etc. And this can cause deterioration or scrambling of messages or videos and that sort of thing. And when you combine that with latency, it's very difficult to correct for that interference, because if you find that you've got a garbled message, now it takes additional time to transmit that information back to get a resend, right? Privacy is just as important in space as it is on Earth. As communications being broadcast through space can easily be picked up by bad actors along the way. And as individuals, I think we all understand the importance of privacy. When it's not there, we run the risk of personal harm. And similarly, organizations such as governments and corporations also need privacy to protect their ideas or the safety of their customers, their constituents, their employees. Collaboration is also important in space, as we're learning and trying new things and trying to figure everything out. So we need content aggregation and messaging systems that allow different people that are working on different projects to be able to collaborate effectively together, given these constraints in terms of latency and speed. And then finally, multimedia is super important, right? So the kinds of information that we'll want to transmit will vary from basic text type of messages, textual information, to rich media that contains video, sound, and possibly even like 3-dimensional data. Could you imagine how cool it would be to capture 3-dimensional data, Mars, and then transmit it back so it could be explored and analyzed in a sort of VR 3D environment? So, bandwidth is plentiful, but latency and interference are concerns. How can we use the technologies that we've developed so far to create social media networks to address these challenges and enable communication in space to be functional? So before we dive in, I think it's important to talk a little bit about social media and how various social networks are differentiated based on the type of content that people primarily engage with. So from Wikipedia, definition of social media are interactive media technologies that facilitate the creation and sharing of information, ideas, interests, and other forms of expression through virtual communities and networks, right? So some social networks are content forward, right? Like Facebook or Instagram. By content forward, I mean, when you open the application, the first thing you see is a feed of content, and the experience is optimized to get you to scroll and consume content and engage with it and keep you there. Other, apps like this are more messaging or content creation forward. So I think Snapchat is a very classic example of this. When you open Snapchat, the first thing you see is a camera. And the idea is that you are creating a message, you're sending it visually to other people, and you're primarily using the app to communicate and connect, right? And in addition, Snapchat's messages are ephemeral, which encourage this sort of authentic connection, which I will talk about more a little bit. So, given that latency is a concern and communications are lagging, and by the way, so that's just sort of a high level of what social networks are. Now I want to talk about how do we leverage what we built the social networks to address the challenges I had outlined before. And latency is one of those challenges, and communications can lag as long as 24 minutes. Real-time communication is going to be far less convenient, right? So, with that big lag, you can't make a call, you can't make a video call. 4-minute, 24-minute lag is not going to work, right? So this is a place where the aggregation aspect of social and the asynchronous communication aspects of social media platforms can be an advantage, right? So for example, a feed aggregates communications created by users in the network over a period of time, right? So those communications in social media, we know of them as posts or content, right? And the algorithms that power those feeds make sure that the user is seeing the most relevant content to them at any given time. And so because you have this latency that's happening, you're not going to be able to just scroll endlessly, right? So when you're scrolling endlessly today in a social media application, when you hit the bottom of what's in your feed, it has to go back to the network and load that next piece up. And so it's constantly hitting the network and transmitting data back and forth. With this latency, that just wouldn't be acceptable, right? So there would be a need to preload that content into the user's system well in advance, which means that the algorithms need to be even more accurate in terms of figuring out what that user might want or need to be viewing at any given point in time. So, imagine, if the feed was containing information that was useful for a specialist to be able to do their job, right? So the whole concept of enterprise social networks is an emerging concept where you're leveraging a thing like a social network or a feed to be able to capture content that is useful in an enterprise setting or sort of a work or collaborative setting, right? And so imagine if that feed did contain that information. Let's say it was the latest research that's relevant to their work, or updates on key projects, or results from a distributed computing cluster, or analysis from other specialists elsewhere in space or on Earth. Instead of having to optimize for what social networks optimize for today, which is keeping you stuck to the experience, right? They would need to be optimized maybe for productivity or sort of the usefulness of the information, right? So, we could leverage a lot of these models. We have to think about how to optimize what content we send. We have to think very carefully before we transmit content and think about what's the most relevant pieces. So I would say that in space communication, with that big latency, relevance and having algorithms that are able to predict what's needed become even more critical than they are today. So another aspect that creates challenges here was latency. Real-time communications becomes challenging. So imagine, being on a call with somebody, having to wait 8 to 24 minutes or 8 to 48 minutes for them to respond to your first question, right? 4 minutes for them to receive your question, another 4 minutes to receive the response. So, how would one-to-one communication be facilitated in that sort of environment? So, typically real-time communication is ephemeral, right? That's another aspect that's interesting, right? So when you make a phone call or a Zoom call, like we're having today, the communication, the conversation isn't recorded by default, right? And so that's something we take for granted oftentimes, that this ephemeralness allows us to communicate authentically without fear of the conversation being used against us in some way, or the way that we look. I didn't really spend a lot of time getting ready this morning because, I know this isn't going to be blasted out to everybody, right? So like, I think, that gives us that benefit to be authentic and be able to have the conversations we need to have in order to be effective in how we collaborate and how we connect with one another, right? And so, synchronous video also allows us to collaborate while seeing reactions to thoughts, to ideas, to our work product, right? I think we communicate so much through the visual form. And so having that real-time feedback is so useful. But in a world where asynchronous communication, is the norm because of the latency, how do we try to maintain some of these benefits, right? So, one of the things I talked about was the ephemeral nature of real-time communication and, a social network. And again, I work at Snapchat, so I'm a little biased in this direction, but Snapchat's messages, are by default, messages of video are by default ephemeral. So when you open Snapchat, the first thing you see is a camera that you can use to capture a photo or a video. Then you can also apply filters, which we also known as lenses. They add special effects to your photo or video, which allow you to add more expression and information to the content that you produce. And when someone receives your message, they can choose to respond with text or video. But because of that inability to have face-to-face collaboration, I think in space, maybe there'll be more video communication to kind of increase that bandwidth of information. And sort of applications like Snapchat make it easy for that to occur. And because they're ephemeral messages, they disappear after a short period of time unless they're saved by one of the participants, which can also help with privacy concerns, in addition to making sure that that communication is sort of authentic and direct. And I think when it comes to collaboration, authenticity is so important, right? Being able to understand, where people are coming from, how they feel about something, right? Facts are important, data is important, but at the end of the day, as humans, we have to make judgment calls and decisions. And oftentimes those need to be informed by, how we feel about the incompleteness of the data we have. We have to make those judgment calls. We have to have debates, and those debates can become heated. And so being able to have that extra ability to have that bandwidth of communication and that authenticity of it, I think will go a long way. So how do we handle the interference that comes from space communication? Interference is going to be a huge challenge, especially given that, that we have latency, right? Which means that if data arrives garbled, it's going to take additional time for corrections. So we're going to need advanced error correction capabilities. Work is being done today, to use AI to correct images and videos that contain artifacts. So, for example, it's being used to improve the quality of image and video content in social media. So as an example, maybe a picture was taken in low light and has noise from lack of signal because it's low light, or perhaps the image or audio was transmitted over a low bandwidth connection. Maybe it's in a rural area or developing country with lower quality internet connection. And so it's heavily compressed. AI is being used to sort of replace that noise and replace compression artifacts with corrections. So maybe that technology can continue to be extended and expanded and become even more useful in space, where we don't have time to go back and ask for corrections. We need to do those in real time without that assist. And then, finally, today's social networks are centralized. How could decentralized social networks have a place in space communications? So, today's social networks are owned by various entities. For example, Facebook and Instagram are owned by Meta, Snapchat's owned by Snap. This means that content created on and posted on these networks is actually, technically under that control of that entity. And so some people, might have concerns with that, right? They might want to control their content, especially if you're trying to decouple yourselves from the existing systems and sort of ownership models that are, we're bound by here on Earth. Could you benefit from leveraging a decentralized social network to create a whole new network that, is independent and not coupled so tightly there? And so there's a new type of social networking emerging that I learned about as I joined Snap is called DeSo. And what DSO stands for is distributed social. And it's the first and only blockchain that is built from the ground up to power and scale a new category of decentralized social applications to 1 billion users. So, it aims to allow content creators to control their content versus the social networking companies. And in addition to distributing ownership of that content so that it's no longer centralized, it also supports end-to-end encrypted on-chain messaging, right? So that also addresses the privacy concern. So that's an emerging technology that could also be, useful here and worth exploring. So with that, I want to close with a few questions to think about, what are other challenges that, people might have communicating in space that are unique to space? How else might the technology that social media has brought us help us to address those challenges? And what new technologies might we need that we haven't even considered? I want to use my remaining time to open it up for discussion. I want to see if you have any questions, if you have other ideas or answers to the questions I just posed, challenges with space communication you want to talk about, or ideas on social media ordinance solutions. Love to have that conversation.
This is all great. And it's so important. I mean, as much as we don't want to say, or admit it, I think social media, everybody's on it, whether it's Instagram, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Snapchat. I mean, especially these younger generations, this is the way to reach them. But I think something that we run into a lot is false information. I mean, I'm in the news business. I'll admit it. It's a struggle a lot of times with facts getting out there and then misinformation. Are there ways that as members of the space community, we can be the most responsible for our posts? And how can we motivate and encourage these future generations using the power of social media to make a difference, but also make sure it's more factual versus something that people are just using for, as you say, clickbait?
Yeah, I love that question so much. I think that, I was talking here about how we can leverage social media in space. And I think what we're talking about here now is like, how do we leverage social media to further the cause of getting humanity into space, right? And I think that is an important conversation to have. And one of the things that we've been learning, even though like we control the social media platforms, Snap, I'm part of Snap, me and my team, we control Snap, right? And Facebook was that, and Facebook and Instagram, etc. What we're learning is that the most engaging content that we can present to our users is not like what's content being created by the person with the highest followers. Like the person with the highest followers in the world is Cristiano Ronaldo. He's a soccer player, right? But like if he posts something, it's not going to, if he were to go post about space, it's not going to help solve your problem, right? The way you need to do that is to create highly engaging content, right? So it's not like social networks are no longer about, how many connections you have, how many followers you have, etc. It's about, can you create extremely engaging content that can go viral? And so what I would do is I would think about like, how can I take the message that I have and turn it into something that is going to resonate with my audience, right? So in our case, Gen Z. And one thing I've been learning is that Gen Z, 13 to 24-year-olds ish, they are far more unique. I feel like, boomers to Gen X to millennials felt like an incremental step in terms of the differences between the generations. When you think about it in contrast to Gen Z and millennials, it's a huge step change in terms of, how they think about the world, what matters to them. And so I think it takes very careful analysis. You need to spend time talking to that group, before you can even send them a message and tell them, hey, here's why space is important. You need to sit down with them and learn about what they care about, like what matters to them, right? And some of the things you're going to find out is that they really care about people. They care about connection. They care about social justice. They care about the environment. Even more so than previous generations. There used to be that people would become, a certain generation would become more conservative politically at a very linear rate over time. This generation is not. It's going pretty flat, right? So that's another example of how different they are, right? And I'm not trying to make a value judgment of whether that's good or bad, right? I'm just trying to say that's the generation. And so how do you understand them and how do you reach them? You need to go and talk to them and listen to them to be able to craft the right message.
Exactly. How many people remember cassette tapes? And that's how we listened to music back in the day, you know, and then we went into CD players. And even some of the kids now are like, what is a CD player? I mean, it's amazing to see, but we still have to reach generations, whether it's the newest or the oldest. A great question coming in from Inara. From your perspective, coming from Amazon and Snap, is there a focus on a human feature in space when it comes to product roadmaps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think right now, and a lot of publicly traded companies, as you know, we're always worried about, the next quarter, right? Or the year-over-year results. And, while we have this vision, like at Snap, we have a vision of furthering human progress by enabling connection. It's so easy for us to lose sight of the big picture in the long term. And so, the answer is, I don't think there is that focus, and I think there needs to be, and I think that's a problem. But what oftentimes happens is that, we're trying to just survive that next quarter. Like in the current macroeconomic environment, advertisers are pulling back, right? And so, you end up being in a situation, Facebook's the situation too, where it's like, how do we continue to make the money we need so we can exist and serve our customers in the face of this environment? And what we really should also be doing is thinking about in the long term, how do we enable human progress leveraging space? And so I think that's a missing component. And like, how do we get there? How do we make that a focus is going to be challenging given, the current, even in a really good macroeconomic environment, it's challenging because it's hard to say like, okay, if we do, invest in space, what's that ROI going to be, right? And so I think that might be where this community, like trying to find places where that, so it's a win-win, right? So that we can, generate the revenue we need so that we can serve our customers better, while also finding ways to further along the mission of space, human future in space.
Right. I mean, you just look at everyone always wants to know what's in it for me. How's this going to impact me? And I think the more we get this conversation going, the more we're communicating, the more people realize that this is going to impact every single person's life on this planet and then planets to come. And it's going to start with all of us making that a reality and making those facts the truths that we're speaking. A great question coming in from Titan. Any insight into using quantum entanglement for comms? I like that question.
No, actually, that is not an area that I have any knowledge in, but I would love to hear if you have thoughts on it. I'm curious.
We'll talk.
All right. Well, if it does, feel free to raise your hand. That is a really good question. I'm going to take that one.
Sorry.
Into it.
Yeah, no, part of that is just I have a interest in everything science and Star Trek and so forth. Star Trek's big into quantum entanglement and so forth and that stuff. But I know that there's work being done with that subject matter. It's not sci-fi anymore. People are looking into it. And if you talk about the equivalent of Starfleet's ability to talk on subspace, quantum entanglement seems to have our best chance for it. And I mean, just in the process, if you look at the process of how we develop new technology, you can only imagine what great stuff will come from just being able to develop quantum communication, zero time zero time communication, opposed to light speed communications.
Yeah, basically zero latency, right? It would solve the latency problem, right? There'd just be no latency.
Yeah.
And all of the things. Yeah,
put Starlink out of business.
Yeah. It would actually benefit on Earth and outside of it everywhere, right? I think it also would change the way computers work, because even computers are bound by latency, even within a computing platform, right? And so, like, I think it would be such a game changer that I couldn't even imagine what it would, what the world would look like, right? I think I remember reading a little bit, because I'm a huge Trekkie as well. And so I remember reading a little bit about this. And my understanding is that we're still a long ways away from being able to harness it and apply it. But I think if it could be applied, yeah, because of the zero latency, you just basically removed half of the challenges that I, articulated, right? And so I think that, like, suddenly, you wouldn't have all these limitations in terms of real-time communication in space, et cetera. And I think that would be important. So I think, to your point, maybe it's worth us, investing more resource into making that, applied, right? Because as we go to space, it becomes more important. I think it's not as urgent right now on Earth because we have fiber optics and all of these things that enable rapid, low latency communication. So like, we're fine, right? And that's how we operate. We don't want to over-invest in something if it's not going to provide immediate benefit. But when we get to space, it becomes very important. So that's a good call out.
Yeah, the moon won't be so bad either. It's only about 5-second worst case scenario, and you can live with that. But definitely when Mars becomes settled and we're talking about regular communications. I mean, I've seen people talking about theoretical GPS and building their own internet on Mars. They're also, actually, I just saw an article. There's several organizations working right now to work on the GPS for the moon, even before getting built before Artemis 3. I think that was one of the things they want to try to have that in place before Artemis 3. So just extending our conveniences out into the universe is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, actually, don't underestimate the sort of impatience customers have. So like, or just people have. So like moon, 5 seconds of latency. So I say something and then 5, 4, 3, like that's a long time, right? You can't have a real-time communication there, right? And so as more and more people are in that distance, they're going to be demanding real time. That's what they're used to, right? And so I think that that's that sort of push that you need to get people to say, hey, if I can solve this problem, I'm going to capture everyone on the moon that's there, right? So I think that's the kind of when it comes to industry, like we're prioritizing, or say tech, like we're prioritizing these sorts of things based on consumer demand. So you got to first create a problem, right? And then once the problem's there, then we're going to look at solving it, right? And so we're not typically solving problems that are 20 years out, right? Because that's risky. How can you predict if that's going to be a real problem?
Awesome.
One little historical note: latency is not a new issue. Back during the Apollos 15, 16, and 17, they had the robotic camera on the lunar rover, and when the astronauts were going to lift off from the moon and return to Earth, they would park the rover a certain distance away so they could document the launch. Well, for the first 2 launches, the camera operator back in Houston didn't realize about the latency. So he was always 5 seconds behind. So the story I heard when I was at NASA was that these guys rehearsed, and in Apollo 17, they got it perfect. So latency is not a new issue. It's just something we're getting around to.
Yeah, and like Kevin points out that, we have it for presentations. Of course, it's fine if it's a presentation, but like when you're trying to do something that requires real time, that's when it becomes an issue. But yeah, all great call outs.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hopping back in. Titan and Alex, thank you so much. That presentation was wonderful. I mean, just giving us more to think about. And that's the great thing about these conversations. It's a conversation. It doesn't end here. So we're going to take what we learned today, reach out, make these connections, start new conversations, and eventually we're all going to be 10 years from now, probably looking back and just being very glad that we started them today. So thank you so much, Alex. We are now going to move on to our final guest for this morning, which I'm so excited to introduce you to Mike Carey. Mike is from Atlas Space Operations Incorporated. He's the founder and chief operating officer. Now, before Atlas, General Carey spent 34 years in the U.S. Air Force, beginning as an airman basic and attaining the rank of Major General. Thank you for your service. His time with the military provided a unique knowledge of space and cyber communication systems. He has since taken his skill sets to the private sector and serving as the CEO of AAC Microtech North America before moving on to found Atlas Space Operations. Carey lets his values lead his efforts, working to create a company culture where his team members feel empowered to bring about change in brand new ways that will lead to bigger and better benefits. The Atlas team knows that this happens when they work together, communicate, and push boundaries. Leading by example, Carey empowers the Atlas team to enact changes through revolutionary technology in a collaborative and dynamic environment. These practices work together to achieve Atlas's broader vision, making space access secure, affordable, and agile. General Carey holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Central Florida, an MPA from the University of Oklahoma, and an MA in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College. He's proud to have returned to his home state of Michigan, this time creating jobs and driving innovation. High five. Thank you so much for being here with us, General, and we are really happy to have you now for this part of Conversations for the Future.
Hey, Meredith, thanks so much for the kind introduction. And I'll tell you the opportunity to be part of the Conversations for the Future is really something I look forward to do and honored to be part of this community. I'll tell you, Alex and Titan, you guys, boy, you're all over it, and it's really enthusiastic approach to imagining solutions for problems that are, I mean, they're really just before us. They're not quite there yet, but we're gonna be there before you know it. And kind of like Meredith said, 10 years from now, we're gonna look back and go, thank God we had these conversations. You know, Atlas provides satellite communications infrastructure as a service. Right now, we support the Earth orbiting endeavors of our customers, but we are also supportive of those that are cislunar and out to the moon. Interplanetary is a whole nother problem, right? One of the things that we all know, and I'm going to state the obvious a few times here is that this morning, is communications is what not only enables our societies, but it connects our societies. And so communications around on the surface of Earth wasn't that long ago. I remember hearing echoes on telephone calls that were transoceanic. There was a delay. It was a noticeable delay. And I also remember one time on an airplane, a military airplane over the Atlantic, making a stateside phone call. And it was in such a way that when I was done with my statement, I had to say over, and then the individual on the other line would then say what they were going to say and let me know they were done by saying over. And so telecommunications in just the last couple of decades has dramatically changed on the surface of the Earth, or and just above the surface of the Earth. And what we expect now in real time or near real time for spacecraft in low Earth orbit really is taken to a new level. And then there's going to be relay capabilities and optical comms, which dramatically reduce the latency for orbiting spacecraft and people who are in orbit as well. And I think that what we'll find on the moon and then likely Mars, I imagine that it'll be replicated, is comm systems that support the local activity, which will be mirrored, will be mirroring those on Earth, right? So the near real time and real time nature of communication will exist in proximity to Moon or Mars, and it's between those two or three places that the distances, the tyranny of distance really comes to play, right? And so I wonder if when we populate orbits and infrastructure on the surface of those celestial bodies, if the surface or near surface of the moon and surface near surface of Mars will be replicated, or will we improve upon based on the environments that they afford us? And has that all been figured out? My sense is not. The infrastructure is going to have to withstand different environmental challenges. The atmospheres are different, so the physics of communications will be somewhat different. Some of this has been scoped out, but I don't know that it's been scoped out in the way that will support a burden or a load that's anticipated. So I think that the opportunities for evolving communication models, and I think a mesh or a mix of telecommunication capabilities is going to be forthcoming. I remember somebody not that long ago decrying the value of AM radio. And then I heard somebody at the University of Michigan talk about how AM radio actually can be repurposed and re-engineered to be far more useful. And I got to tell you, AM radio just doesn't pop to the top of my mind when I think about communication systems on Earth. But it's still a thing. It's still a market. It's still a real thing. So does that mean that somewhere out on the moon or on Mars there will be an AM radio station or an FM radio station or something along those lines of a consumer, or are we going to jump directly to a space base or an optical comm, or is it going to be a combination of those things? I guess I'd actually like to ask this community, what do they envision the population? What are the consumers going to be using in the future on Moon or Mars? Does anybody got a Titan or Alex? You got to put on that.
Well, first thought is I grew up with AM and FM just like you did, and that has not, as time has gone by, and I've become more used to the wireless environments of data, Wi-Fi, LTE, and so forth. So those have kind of fallen to the back, but they do present an opportunity for other, maybe not necessarily commercial entertainment, but for other uses. I mean, the frequency bands are very important. That's how we communicate in the world, and people don't realize how much of the frequency bandwidth, how important it is just to the economy. I mean, some of the huge bandwidth auctions back in the late 90s were huge. There was a lot of behind the scenes people didn't know about, but for not only commercial use, public use, but also military and other sectors. So yeah, there's always an opportunity for using, but I don't see when we settle the moon and Mars, people are going to turn on their radios. They'll have another pipeline. Essentially, it's everybody wants their entertainment and their information. It's a matter of how it gets to you. It's
right.
Whatever's working that day. Like we talked about, it was LPs and it was CDs, or excuse me, LPs, cassettes, CDs, streaming. It's the same stuff, just coming a different pipeline. So we just have to find what infrastructure supports it. And and something that I've learned during the transition from analog television to digital, there was a lot of people pushing different versions of it, but we found out very early on, you don't want to commit to something you want to make sure whatever you're doing is you're future-proofing yourself. Make sure that whatever you're doing now isn't going to burden you later on, because we went from analog to digital, and somebody was transferring all their, like at NASA, NASA's library is vast, it's huge, video, film library. It was all film for many years, and then they were trying to transfer it. While they did library, the original negatives, they would transfer it to standard def analog. When the digital came along, we spent a lot of time transferring all that analog to digital, but in standard def. Well, then when it came time when high def came along, we couldn't transfer that to standard def because it was only 480 lines, and film has a much higher resolution. So we had to go back and rescan everything into high definition. Well, they did that at 1080i. Well, now what? We have 1080p, we have 2K, 4K, 8K. So now they're going back and resolving it. You want to, whatever technology you develop, you want to future-proof yourself. You want to make sure it's you scan it at the highest available format. Fortunately, and or unfortunately, the resolutions for commercial use, anything of about 2K, the human eye really can't see it. So it's only good for large scale presentation. So for the mass media, 2K is enough. But for science and archival purposes, obviously you want to scan at the highest rate. And that's always going to change. You're always going to develop new, higher sensitivity sensors and so forth like that. But future-proof is the magic term.
Yeah, Alex, you got a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would kind of add to that, I think all that is great. Like I think one thing that we kind of have a problem here on Earth. I was thinking that's similar, which is if I were a streaming service, like I was broadcasting live to my audience, right? I wouldn't rely on one channel, and they don't, right? So they'll have they'll have multiple different internet providers connected to them. Some maybe they have a fiber optic one, a coax one, that they might have like radio. And so all of this is to ensure that, you know, if one cuts out, you know, there's a sort of redundancy, right? And sometimes they'll multiplex and use multiple bandwidth or multiple so that they can increase their bandwidth, right? So you can imagine that, you know, in space, you wouldn't say, well, I'm just going to rely on this one transmission technology. You know, I'll take all the ones that I can possibly get, right? And try to merge them together to create as big of a pipeline I can get, and one that is as redundant as possible. So I think it'll be interesting, right? I think we'll probably be using technologies that we now think as outdated, but they might be useful, you know, there as sort of like backups or to increase bandwidth.
That's kind of where my head's at, frankly. In my business today, right? S band, X band, Ka band, C band, you know, the traditional SATCOM allocations according to the ITU, right? Does the ITU matter on Mars? Does the ITU matter on Moon? Does, you know, the FCC doesn't have a regulatory authority, you know, over those planets. But if we suspend the regulatory, which I think will have to be addressed at some point, what I tend to think of, and somebody in chat, it was you, said ham radio, right? So today, if you think of communications, like cell phone goes down, and when I was working in the Pentagon, a hurricane was coming up the East Coast, was going to hit Washington, D.C. for the first time in like a long time. And the chairman asked me, he says, so what kind of comm system do I have? And I explained to him that his survivable communications was basically the nuclear communications network. And he goes, no. Like, how do I call the director of operations? I said, you mean when your cell phone system goes down and landlines down? So it's sort of, you know, you have to use a sat phone. And so we issued sat phones and generators for a period of time to senior officers, because that was the only survivable means, because, you know, that's what it was. So if you go to, you know, some surface off Earth and you think about proximate communications, like living society on another planet, not just satellites communicating long distance, but society on another planet, I think you really bring back the whole suite of communication capabilities. I mean, what's to stop us from just replicating some tried and true? Now, I know ionospheric differences are going to be different. The atmospheric is going to be different. So we have to think through that. But I imagine that there will be a public broadcast system, right? Hey, there's a solar storm coming. Hey, there's a, you know, Mars's red eye storm is, you know, there's weather forecasting on the Moon and on Mars that people are going to have to be aware of, right? And they'll need to plan their activities around whatever is going on. And sometimes optical is not going to work. And sometimes we don't need that much data. They don't need that much of a pipe, right, for whatever you're doing. Like mining operations, you know, they use telemetry systems, but they don't use high data. So I think that the whole societal element can bring with us, you know, and maybe we can improve upon the allocation of frequencies, if you will. But, you know, is there an emergency network, and how is that information going to get out? Is there a safety network? You know, what about medical frequencies? You have the opportunity, I think, to create headers for transmissions to preclude them from being disrupted. There's talk of that. There has been talk of that for quite some time. You know, when people consider the implications of interfering with satellite communications during medical or emergency procedures or Red Cross transmissions, there should be headers that allow some kind of declaration of, you know, essentially a Red Cross on this transmission, don't mess with it, or give it priority. You know, there's an opportunity to re-scheme comm infrastructure. So there's a technical side, right, which I think we've touched on previously, which addresses the latency between planets. But there's also the thing I think is most interesting is what about communications on the new planet, on the other planet, that connects our societies, but also creates a society in and of itself on Mars or the Moon, or name your favorite entity. So we've only got 10 more minutes, Meredith. What would you like to do with the remaining 10 minutes? We could go 100 different directions.
Well, what I've loved so far about this is how everyone's just kind of jumping in and the conversations just keep going off of the initial conversations, which is great. I was just asking if anyone has any specific questions for Mike, but I think you bring up some really good points too. And for somebody, you've seen it all. You've worked for the government, you've worked in the private sector. Where do you see most of the success with communications? Do you seeing it being something that's driven by government, or do you see it being more the private sector kind of figuring out our own ways with communications, especially like you said, on other planets? We know, I know as a meteorologist, the importance of, say, during a hurricane, and knowing that text messages are better ways to communicate with your family versus the phone lines getting tied up. And even the emergency managers I'll talk to will say, tell people, don't keep the phone lines out. You have to have text messages. Do you feel like something like that is going to be crucial for other planets when it comes to communicating?
I do. And Meredith, thanks for teeing it up, the softball for me. I genuinely appreciate that. And I say softball because it's something that I thought about a lot. And when you said text messaging, right? And the first thing that came to my mind just prior to that was, if I had a beeper, or I had some type of some notification device, right? For what are those things? They're low bandwidth, they're low energy, but they're effective. So the benefit that we have that our predecessors on Earth did not have is we've seen a cornucopia of communication devices. We've seen them come and go. We've seen, iPhones and sliders back to, Jerry Seinfeld, style mobile phones, right? All the way back to, Alexander Graham Bell and whatnot. So as we go forward, we can pick what's the best device for the environment we're moving into. You get to pick your survival kit. And I think that there's a survival network, then there's a functioning operational, scientific, or business network, and then there's a social network, right? And so right now we use social media for 100 different things. And that may or may not be the best platform. It might be the most efficient, but it might not be the most resilient, right? And so I think what you're going to find, you said government versus, I'll just say non-government, commercial, civil, whatever. I think it'll be a mix. I think that there is a purpose that governments serve. And I don't know that necessarily populating Mars is one of them. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that exploration. So, for example, NASA, ESA, the space agencies of the world have a mission, but ultimately it's to serve, I believe, humankind as well as national interest. And so those things will drive entities to do things. People are driven, I think, in a more altruistic way. And I also believe that if there's a commercial opportunity, that's a strong driver. And those are the verticals I think that are actually going to push the boundaries to bring capability into, a desire to explore the oceans, a desire to explore frontiers is a human thing. It's not an organizational thing. And I believe that that's what's going to take us to the next level, the next planet.
Absolutely. Mike, another question that came in, what are some of the barriers you face when it comes to engaging the public, but also when it comes to communicating the importance of what your company is building?
So barriers of engaging on what our company is building is the nuanced differences between what Atlas does versus our predecessor competitors. I usually do an analogy like, me and my competitors, we all provide antenna access and provide a service, right? So it's kind of like saying, what's the difference between a taxi, an Uber, and a bus? They all provide, transportation. We are a software heavy company that has a cloud-based access to ground networks, multiple ground networks, not just our own ground network. And we simplify the process and make it secure. So communicating the difference is really the biggest challenge that we have. But I think that engaging, it's not an engagement problem. It's just, it's missionary work. You know, we got to get out there and we've got to socialize the idea that replicating hardware is not a scalable answer to a scaling problem. It's just a clunky way of solving the world's need for better communication services. And ours is one that doesn't behold itself to, if I need to communicate with you, I need to build 5 more antennas or I can't support you. You know, we make other people's equipment more efficient and more interoperable.
I think, you know, this just goes back to show, you know, how connected we are as a society, how much we rely on communication. And, you know, that goes the simplest as a hand radio, as we were talking about. But then now it's like everybody has cell phones, and we see what happens when the internet goes crazy and social media shuts. People lose their minds. And so these are questions and conversations that we need to have sooner than later. And for people that are in these fields and looking to build better ways to communicate, I mean, now is your time. I mean, for people out there that we know that have this big dream or idea, this is your time to encourage those people to step it up and to help. Now, I have another question come in. We probably have time for one more question. So if anyone else has one more question, feel free to drop in the chat. While ensuring the strategic edge for your company, do you have collaborative pathways in place with other companies in mind that could supply vital infrastructure in space or for the future of the work that you're already doing?
Oh, we do. Absolutely. So, you know, we don't believe any one company can solve for the future. And so being a collaborative agent, Atlas reaches out to others who are in adjacent and frankly, in same industry, adjacent industry, as well as I was just on the phone with the gentleman from Europe an hour ago, and their vision for the future, put it 5 years out, is really exciting. And so we want to work together so that we can enable their vision, but they can also alter ours with future use cases that we have not yet scratched at. So I think open collaboration is critical. If you're not going to collaborate with world players, then you really kind of limit yourself to a shelf life in this community.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially when we think about, and I was just having this conversation actually with Inara, how success is never achieved alone. I mean, we go back to even thinking way before with cavemen, for example. They had to be self-sufficient, but they needed the help of other people, because it's the ideas of other people that help us succeed together and figure out these problems together and how we can come up with these solutions that moving forward give us so many different options of how to accomplish something or how to change something for the better of not just ourselves, but for everybody in the communities around us. And I think that's going to be critical. And also why we're having these conversations now to get started before, you know, in this short period of time, we're going to have people back on the moon and eventually on Mars. So,
right.
Anybody
I'm always
else?
taken aback by someone who says that they don't want to collaborate with me. I'm like, why?
Right.
Oh, okay. Did I hurt your feelings?
Yeah, exactly. I think I have one more question coming in. It looks like Andrew has his hand up. I just saw that. So yeah, Andrew, if you have a question or if you have something we want to add, we'll probably wrap it up just shortly after.
Yeah, I want to go back to, applies to a lot we've talked about today, is what we're going to do when we get there. And one of the things that is a conversation that I think doesn't get talked about enough is when we go to the moon and we go to Mars, self-governance. Are we going to be beholden to the mother planet for regulations and so forth? I mean, initially we will be because of the supply chain and so forth. But like a lot of discussions been started about when you go to Mars and settle Mars, are we going to be a state or an offshoot of Earth, or are we going to create our own governance? And by that extension, decide how we want things to happen, both from social, economic, technical, so forth, make our own rules. That's an opportunity to rethink humanity, the way we do things. And Mars gives us a great opportunity to maybe try a different way of doing things. And that, of course, lends itself to the we decide how we want to communicate. Yes, we're going to have use the old AM band for emergency or whatever. And it's something that they can do when they get there. They can decide this is what we want to do as opposed to what's been done in the past too. So there's a chance for a new start on that, a lot of that type of stuff.
Andrew, one of the things it draws to my mind is all of a sudden I got the company store and I got the examples of of American history kind of come to mind. But there's tons others, and there's a lot of science fiction. I'll say forecasting that kind of gives us things to consider. One thing I don't want this conversation to take away, I don't want people to take away that Mike Carey said AM radio is the wave of the future on Mars. So that's
an example.
Example of the bookends, right? So you got quantum computing and Morse code. Somewhere in there is this fabric that we're going to apply in new societies. So
yeah, but they're all tools. That's the thing. Your toolbox can never have enough tools, and if that includes older tools that are reliable, you use them. But it's all part of the bigger picture.
I'll be taking my wedge to Mars. So.
Me too. Absolutely.
So fun when we're all traveling and high-fiving each other and whatever we're going to do, like I said, in 10 years from now, maybe even 5 years from now. So a lot of exciting things going on. It is time, unfortunately, to end this conversation, which has been incredible for the last 2 hours. Mike Carey, thank you so much. We had Inara, we had Daniel, we had Titan, Andrew. We just had such a great Alex. Everyone was great that was on today. And again, I think what we need to take from these conversations is they're not ending today. The story is still being told, and we are the storytellers. And the more stories that we can tell, the more we can build on other stories moving forward in our lifetime. So everybody, if you go in the chat, we have had everyone post their information. Mike, if you want to drop the best way to connect with you there, we've had LinkedIn profiles, emails. But again, you can find all of us on LinkedIn. We're here for you. We all are the future. And by participating in events like this, we are paving the way, not just for our life, but for the generations to come, as we are the leaders and we are the movers and shakers, as we like to call it. So again, my name is Meredith Garofalo. I'm so glad that you joined us today for Foundation for the Future. Check out what Foundation for the Future is doing. Get on the newsletter. Tim couldn't be here today, the executive director, but he is great. He's got so much insight and passion for what we're all doing. So again, thanks for coming today. Happy Tuesday. Happy January. If you're out in the Northeast, you know how warm it's been, which has been weird, but as a meteorologist, hopefully you enjoy that forecast.
Meredith, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time, your talent, your energy, and look forward to getting to know you better in the future.
Yes, sounds good. We'll chat for sure after this.